I lead the Confluence editor team. For the last 1.5 years, I've been working on trying to bring the new editor out to our customers in Confluence Cloud. And before I worked on the editor, I worked on the ecosystem, building APIs with my team and building more things in the Confluence Cloud for ecosystem to use. There's been one key differentiator between working in the editor and working on ecosystem for me in Atlassian. When I worked on ecosystem, the important thing for me was to try to understand what all the people who were building things on Confluence Cloud were actually needing to do. Whereas in the editor, I've needed to understand what Confluence's customers actually do and what do they need of the product. So today, I wanted to share some of the insights that I've learned in the 1.5 years about our customers to you, and maybe show you a bit like what sort of applications can you develop to those customers who we have for Confluence. So I like to kind of categorize our customers into 4 different groups. The first one is just the content consumers. These are people who do have the Confluence license, but they mostly use it just to read pages, read documentation there. They log in every now and then to check out, for example, how to set up a development environment, maybe read some meeting notes, but they rarely do any collaboration there. They just kind of read Confluence and don't get it as much. The next group, which is the group where people actually start interacting with Confluence, is a group we call content creators. These are people who start actually influencing like their organization and showing, creating meeting notes, maybe start documenting things and storing things into Confluence. But often the content creators still use a very small percentage of the features that there are in Confluence. They may use some of the simpler macros like code macros or others, but often they don't go very deep into Confluence and are just kind of like trying it out and seeing how it is. Then there's the group that we call super users. This is the group that really embraces Confluence. And this is the group also that when you're developing apps, you maybe start needing to think about like, okay, these are the people who really, really do powerful things in Confluence. How can I make them more powerful? And the last group are the actual admins, the people who purchase Confluence, install them, and configure and set the Confluence and all the different ways how it's being used. So in this talk, I want to focus on the latter 2 groups and show you a couple of things that you can build for them. But first, let's focus on super users. So who are super users? I want to tell you a bit of like the usage patterns for this. But first, how many here, show me a hand if you've already used the new Confluence Cloud Editor? Most, okay. For those who still haven't, and if you're familiar with the old editor, we're bringing in a new editor in Confluence Cloud, and we're currently in a process of rolling this out to all of our customers. Couple of like the key things that we wanted to bring with the new editor. We wanted to make it much more like user-friendly and easier to use for those new people so that it would be less intimidating for maybe those just consumers who are looking to page actually move into creating Confluence pages. The other key differentiator in the new editor is that we wanted to make all the macros up here in edit the same as they do in view. We wanted to kind of blur the lines a bit between viewing and editing a page so that people have much easier time when they're actually creating the content and they don't need to preview it, they don't need to kind of think about what it would look in when it's published because it already appears like that in the editor. So if we talk about super users, a couple of the key features that super users would use is they configure their workflows to look at like how to make it really effective on the way how they use it. One of the key things that they can use is some of the templates and blueprints that Confluence has, and they can create new ones to actually allow creating new sort of patterns on how they want to bring the content into Confluence. They can create, for example, a custom project report for them that they then use. The other thing we've noticed that super users often start doing is they use our keyboard shortcuts. One of the best keyboard shortcuts that there is for the new editor is the new slash menu. that allows you to insert any kind of content, including macros or some of the native elements very easily. There's also other keyboard shortcuts like using 2 slashes to insert a date. Or if you want to collaborate between other users, you can use the @ to easily mention other people or teams also across your organization. And this is also one of the things that super users often do. They make Confluence more viral by adding more people and mentioning people and inviting them to collaborate with them. The last kind of power thing that the super users do is they use the more advanced macros that Confluence brings. There's a lot of macros that aggregate and collect data from different sources in Confluence, and super users are the people who we've often targeted these features for. And super users are often the people who also use third-party integrations and bring that information into Confluence. This is a common use case in many organizations who have Confluence installed. They also have various amount of other tools where they're bringing data in from. They have Jira, where they have all of their issues tracked and projects managed. They have Glyphy, or some other diagramming tool where they may have some designs. Splunk for operational logs or something like this. And also the information is scattered between various Confluence pages. Often, if you have your upper management, they don't want to go into these individual tools. They need simple reports and simple ways to actually get this in a easily findable way. And what super users often do is they take these different sources of data, they bring it into a single Confluence page, and then forward that page for the upper management to read this information. I want to focus now a bit on how to build one of these integrations into Confluence. I want to focus on Splunk. There may already be a Splunk integration in the marketplace, but I just built a very simple one just to demonstrate like what you can do. So for those who have never used Splunk, Splunk is essentially a log aggregation tool that allows creating of reports and searches based on the information that is there. We use it, for example, to measure performance. And then from all these searches and what you have in Splunk, you can then create different sorts of reports. So I wanted to create an application that takes these reports and easily puts them into a Confluence page. I'll first show you a demo of this, and then I'll show you how you can easily build this. So first, you just create a page. And once you enter the page, and you have inserted a title, once you create like these custom integrations, for example, in this case, you want to have an app performance report on Confluence, you use the slash menu, and if you have a Splunk report macro, it appears on the slash menu. And now you can select the reports straight from Confluence, insert it, and it displays the actual graph of the report once it's loaded from Splunk. And then you can publish the page. And then because we've actually included a section of Splunk report directly into the page, you can now interact with it with the capabilities that Splunk brings with the embedded reports. So to build this sort of feature, you need to define a new macro in Confluence using the Connect framework. How many here have used, like, developed applications for Confluence before, or used Connect? Okay, most, but some not. That's good, because I'm not going to go that very deeply into how Connect actually works. But what you essentially do with the Connect framework is you define app modules and different modules into the application, and once you've defined them, they appear in the product. One of these key modules to develop a macro in Confluence is a module called Dynamic Content Macro. Dynamic Content Macro essentially is an iframe within Confluence where you can insert any kind of data. In this case, we just added a Splunk embed report there. When you're defining a Dynamic Content Macro module, one of the key things there is, of course, the name and the value. So in our case, I defined a Splunk report. The next key part is the URL. This is the URL where Confluence then, when loading a page with a Splunk macro in it, will fetch the actual contents of the macro and embed it in iframe. So when that page is loaded with the macro in, Confluence makes a call to your product server in the defined URL that you had. Then your product server can fetch the information from Splunk, and once it gets the response, it can then return this, the iframe contents back into Confluence and then display the report on a page. The couple of other things, key things in the dynamic content macros is the output types. In this case, we had a block macro, which means it took like the whole width of a page and it appears as a block in a page. There's 4 kinds of macros that you can define in Confluence by defining the output type and the body type. So first one is the block macro, for example, the Splunk report, but other macros in Confluence like table of contents are block macros also. Then there's inline macros where the output type is inline. These inline macros are macros that you can put within bullet points or within text and embed them, and they are just a line of text essentially there. Plain text macros are kind of like block macros. This is a new feature that we've added into the new editor where plain text macros, they appear as block macros in the actual pages, but they do have a plain text body where you can add, for example, code or something that you need to render into the actual block outside of it. But they do have a body that is of type plain text. And the last one is a bodied macro, which is a macro that has a rich text body within the editor that you can then render in the actual view page in whatever way you like. Our own example of a bodied macro is the expand macro, where you define in the editor what you want to expand, you put the content inside that, and then in the view it appears as an expandable item in the page. The other thing that you can define when you are defining your report is the custom editor for it. So in this case, the modal dialog where the user chooses the report is yet again an iframe. And this is defined in the dynamic content macro module by defining the editor there. The key part here is again the URL. It is yet again an iframe that you can put in there, and you can put whatever kind of content or custom editing you want there. The second part is you have an edit title and an insert title and how you want your modal dialog to look. There's one more thing that you can also define. This is kind of an undocumented trick, but once you add the report, you probably noticed that it directly popped up the dialog there. A lot of people have asked me how to do this, how to make the dialog appear directly after you've inserted the macro using the slash menu. The way to do it is by defining parameters for your macro. And what you specifically want to do is have one mandatory parameter. You can keep it as a default value, but once you've defined one mandatory value, that makes the edit dialog appear directly after you've inserted the macro. And once you've done all this, your report appears on the page and it's usable for your users. So let's get back a bit to our super users. This is an example of an integration that could be built for our super users, because often the thing that super users do is they aggregate and they control the data. And data is always all over the place. It's in a different reports, different tools and somewheres. But often when you need to create something for the upper management, the super users need to aggregate this. So if you're building something for the super users in mind, think about like how can you help make their job easier and how can you make them more effective. Super users also customize their workflow. They use templates and they use add-ons to make Confluence work their way. They want to see the more powerful they are, the more effective they are at their job. And Confluence helps them do that, and all the apps can do that. And the one other thing that super users often do, they're the biggest fans of Confluence. They spread the message of Confluence to different users. Often when they join new companies, they then may become either admins, or sometimes the admins are working for them, and they bring Confluence to a new organization because they're the biggest fans, and they want to actually get Confluence installed in a new in a company where it's not using it yet. So I want to focus a bit on the admins next and kind of talk about what sort of apps can we develop for our admins. So, what do admins do? They're the people who often have the credit card that's being used to buy Confluence. That also means they have the credit card that is used to install apps. Admins are the people who install the apps either because they know of them already or someone requests them to do that. Because like admins actually customize the instance, they are often the people who also make Confluence successful. The better the admin, the more successful Confluence is. This holds true to Jira also. The admins kind of make the instance. We've also introduced a new feature in the premium versions, which is analytics, and this is especially targeted for admins who want to see how actively is Confluence used in their instance. I wanted to show an app that I developed kind of in admins in mind, using some of the new features that we've added for the Confluence Cloud or about to add. And this is an app that instead of the developer creating macros for the users, this actually allows admins directly to create macros for the user. So kind of a meta level macro creator. I'll show you a demo. I hope you kind of get what's neat about this. So in this case, we go to the settings panel. This is often where admins do their job, where they configure Confluence. And I've added a section there called custom macros. This is provided by my application. Then this allows creating a macro. In this case, I just want to create a simple macro that adds a confidential banner into a page. The HTML code that does this is added there, and I save the macro, and then it sends the information there. First, to create this admin section, we need to define in the Connect app descriptor a module for admin pages. This is yet again an iframe that just helps define what this looks like. But to actually create the macro, we need a new feature there. If you watch the keynote, you may have noticed we mentioned already that there's dynamic modules now in Confluence Cloud, or we're about to bring them into Confluence Cloud. And this is how the macro is created from the admin pages. To create a macro, we need to use the REST API to create the module dynamically. So instead of actually defining a static file that contains what the macro is, we can just use the REST API to make a call to the Confluence backend, and it will register a module with whatever information you put there. The code to do it is we just need to make a request within our application iframe into the backend. So first, we need to define the URL, which is the REST API URL for the dynamic modules. Next up, the type. In this case, we are posting because we're creating a new macro. And then we need to define the data for the dynamic module. The data for the REST call is exactly the same as it is if you would be defining this as an app descriptor. You just post the same exact module in the REST call as you would when you are defining this statically. You define a dynamic content macro with the key, with the URL. But because you can do this within your application, your users can define them, and you can kind of define like whatever meta way you want to do this. In the code, also just normal error handling. In this case, if the creation was successful, we display a flag saying we were successful or unsuccessful if it was. And then we use the AP, which is the shorthand for the iframe bridge that the Connect framework have, to post the request options and response handler there. And once the macro has been created, once we get a successful there, it's now usable for users. So in this case, if we're now stepping in as a user, admin has created this macro, go to a page. This is a confidential page which we don't want anyone to share. We put the confidential macro. In this case, it's a plain text macro, or the body of the macro, which is the message intended for this confidential macro to be defined. It's added there. And once it's saved, the macro loads. And this is based on the code that the admin defined in the application. And published, it's there. So these dynamic modules, we don't just allow creating macros, we also allow creating dynamic webhooks and web panels. So you can also do these three. I don't have a demo of these, but they work exactly the same way. The REST endpoint is the same, and you use the same exact body as there was for the dynamic macros and as is for the static add-on descriptor. There is a limit, unfortunately. You can have 10 modules per app per instance. So if you need to know what there are a couple of other APIs that we've defined. If you need to actually see all your custom macros, there is also a get call that returns all your defined apps. And there is also a delete call that allows you to then delete if you reach your limit of 10 or you need to customize these. This is available soon. It's not available yet. Currently, this is all developed and it's behind a feature flag. We do have one bug that we need to fix here before we can actually allow everyone to use it, which is to do, once you've created a module, there's caching issue for a while it doesn't appear for the users until a couple of minutes have passed. Once that is fixed so that it appears for the users immediately, we're going to turn on the feature flag and get access for this for everyone. If anyone's kind of more interested in this and wants to know, like, can we add other modules also to be added dynamically, or have other use cases for these that you can think of, come and talk to me and we'll see what we can do. But for now, dynamic content macros and webhooks and panels are the first elements that we're going to bring in. So if we go back, let's talk a bit about still what the admins do. So the admins are the people who create the Confluence instance. They set up the initial spaces, they set up users, they deal with global permissions, and they do all this. The admins are the people who make a Confluence instance successful, because if you have a good admin, most likely your Confluence is very good. They also install the add-ons. These are the people you often want to do your marketing for, because these are the people who actually go and install something. And if something helps them be successful, these people will often, like in their role, they will probably take it. A couple of the resources that I used to create the applications. This is our developer documentation. All the information is there, and once the dynamic modules are out, we're going to put them out there also and publish it as a blog post. So the documentation is there. The next thing, if you are developing an app and want to make it look like it's part of the Atlassian UX, there is AtlasKit. All the components that I did for the application, I just used the React AtlasKit components, made it very easy to create a UI that looks like it's part of the Atlassian suite. And lastly, if you are developing a new app or are just starting, there's the Atlassian Connect.js ref app. It has all the bindings to make the Connect framework and AtlasKit and everything work together. If you've used some of the older versions and are starting again, I would recommend looking at the Connect.js ref app, because that allows you very easily to get into developing on top of AtlasKit. So I want to take you once more back to the 4 different users that we have: the consumers, the content creators, the super users, and the admins. In Confluence, what we're trying to, of course, do is increase the overall amount of users. We want more users for Confluence. In the editor team, especially, our goal initially was to just increase the amount of people who use the editor. We wanted more content creators. But now our focus is more and more towards super users. We want those content creators people who haven't found yet all the macros, haven't yet like utilized the full power, we in the editor team want to make our content creators be more super users. Because those super users are the people who will take Confluence to new places. They will use all the power features. They will use the apps and all the power features. And someday they will either work with the admins or become admins themselves, who then install more things and kind of make Confluence more successful. That is all I had.